Hello, my dear friends. Medieval sex was not rare. It was everywhere, just hidden behind layers of fear, duty, and silence. What looks like a strict and moral world begins to shift the moment you look closer, revealing marriages without love, desire without freedom, and rules that never truly stopped anything. Beneath the surface, people lived double lives, balancing expectation with instinct in ways that feel strangely familiar. Tonight, you step into a world where nothing is exactly as you imagined, and everything feels closer than it should. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight.
If you imagine medieval sex as something distant, rare, and tightly controlled, then the picture forming in your mind is already misleading. It feels natural to assume that a society shaped so heavily by religion would leave little room for desire, that people lived in a world where rules were followed closely and personal impulses were kept in check. This idea creates a sense of order, as if everything were clearly defined and carefully maintained. It suggests a life where intimacy was limited, quiet, and perhaps even unimportant in the larger structure of daily survival. This belief is not entirely without reason. Much of what remains from the Middle Ages comes from official voices, from religious teachings, legal codes, and written expectations about how people should behave. These sources speak with authority. They describe what is allowed and what is forbidden, often in clear and uncompromising terms. When these voices are taken at face value, they give the impression of a world that functioned exactly as instructed, where individuals followed a strict moral path without deviation. But human life rarely fits neatly into what is written. Behind every rule, there is behavior that bends around it. Behind every expectation, some individuals interpret it in their own way. The Middle Ages were no different. Beneath the surface of sermons and laws, people continued to live complex lives, shaped not only by duty, but also by need, curiosity, and desire. The difference was not that these feelings were absent, but that they existed under pressure. This pressure came from many directions. Reputation mattered deeply in medieval communities, where one's standing could affect not just personal life, but also family stability and future opportunities. Religious expectations added another layer, reminding individuals of sin, judgment, and consequence. Together, these forces created a system where behavior was constantly observed, either by others or by one's own conscience. It encouraged outward control, but it could not eliminate inner experience. As a result, a gap formed between what was visible and what was real. Publicly, people appeared to follow the rules. Privately, they navigated their own realities. This gap is not always obvious in traditional records, but it appears in fragments. Court documents reveal disputes that expose hidden relationships. Confessions hint at thoughts and actions that contradict official teachings. Stories and shared knowledge suggest that people were far more aware of these matters than the formal tone of the time would suggest. The more these fragments are considered together, the more the simple image begins to break apart. Medieval society was not defined by the absence of sexuality, but by the way it was structured and controlled. Desire did not disappear. It adapted. It moved into quieter spaces, expressed itself in indirect ways, and continued to exist even when it was not openly acknowledged. Understanding this requires stepping away from modern expectations. Today, discussions about intimacy are often open, personal, and tied to individual choice. In contrast, medieval life placed intimacy within a network of responsibilities. It was connected to family, to property, to social order. It was not simply about two individuals, but about how those individuals fit into a larger system. This changed how people approached it, how they understood it, and how they spoke about it. Living conditions also played a role in shaping these experiences. Many households were crowded, with multiple generations sharing limited space. Privacy was minimal, and daily life unfolded in proximity to others. This meant that even the most personal moments were influenced by the presence of the surrounding environment. Intimacy did not occur in isolation, but within the rhythms of shared living. It required awareness, timing, and often a degree of quiet adaptation. Knowledge of the body further added to the complexity. Without modern scientific understanding, people relied on inherited beliefs and observations. Some ideas acknowledged that both men and women experienced desire, while others framed intimacy primarily in terms of reproduction. These perspectives did not always align, creating a mixture of acceptance and restriction. The body was both recognized and controlled, understood and limited at the same time. What is most striking is how familiar this contradiction feels when examined closely. The difference lies not in the presence of desire, but in how it was handled. Medieval people were no less human. They faced the same internal experiences, but within a system that demanded restraint and offered limited space for personal expression. This created a constant negotiation between what was expected and what was felt. Even authority, which appears strong in written records, had practical limits. Religious teachings could guide behavior, but they could not fully control it. Individuals still made choices, and communities developed their own ways of responding to situations that did not fit neatly within official rules. This meant that life was shaped not only by what was written, but by how people lived within and around those instructions. The more one looks beyond the surface, the clearer it becomes that the Middle Ages were not a world of silence, but a world of quiet complexity. It was a place where desire existed alongside restriction, where rules were followed and bent at the same time. It was not a simple story of control, but a layered reality where human behavior continued, despite the structures placed around it. This is what makes the subject unsettling. It challenges the comfortable assumption that the past was simpler or more controlled. Instead, it reveals a world that is both distant and strangely familiar. A world where people lived with the same impulses, but under conditions that forced those impulses into less visible forms. What seems at first like a world without desire is actually one where desire never disappeared. It only learned to exist in silence beneath the surface. As that silence begins to break, it leads directly into the structure that people trusted the most to control it. Because what comes next is not about freedom or romance, but about how marriage itself turned intimacy into something that had to happen, even when there was no desire at all.
Marriage in the Middle Ages was not something that began with a feeling. It began with an agreement. In most cases, that agreement was shaped long before the individuals involved had any real say in it. Families arranged marriages based on land, alliances, and the need to secure their position within a larger social structure. A union was not simply about two people deciding to share a life. It was about ensuring that property stayed within certain lines, that relationships between families remained stable, and that future generations would continue that order. This meant that the foundation of marriage was not built on personal connection. It was built on expectation. A husband and wife entered the relationship with roles already defined for them. These roles did not come from within the relationship itself. They came from the outside, from the demands of family, community, and tradition. The couple did not create the structure, they stepped into it. Within this structure, intimacy was not seen as something to be discovered or developed over time. It was treated as something that needed to happen. It was part of what made the marriage complete. The physical relationship between husband and wife was not only expected, but it was also required. It was tied directly to the purpose of the union, which was to produce children and continue the family line. This purpose shaped how intimacy was understood and experienced. The absence of personal choice at the beginning made this even more complex. Many couples entered marriage without having spent significant time together. They did not have the opportunity to build familiarity or comfort in the way modern relationships often do. Instead, they moved directly from arrangement to expectation. This created a situation where intimacy was introduced not as a gradual process, but as an immediate obligation. The first night of marriage carried the full weight of this expectation. It was not approached as a private moment between two individuals discovering each other. It was seen as a necessary step that had to be completed. In some cases, there was an unspoken awareness from others in the household, a sense that this moment was being indirectly observed or anticipated. Privacy existed, but it was limited by the environment and by the knowledge that the outcome of that night mattered beyond the couple themselves. For many women, this moment was defined by uncertainty. Their understanding of their own bodies was often shaped by warnings, not by explanation. The experience was not framed as something to explore or enjoy. It was framed as something that had to be endured, something that marked the transition into a new role. For men, there was a different kind of pressure. They were expected to perform their role correctly and without hesitation, to confirm their place within the structure of the marriage. Both individuals were guided more by expectation than by personal readiness. This dynamic continued beyond the first night. Intimacy within marriage was expected to occur regularly, not because of emotional connection, but because it served a clear function. That function was reproduction. Each encounter was understood in relation to the possibility of creating children. Even when desire existed, it was shaped by this expectation. It was not treated as something separate from duty. It was absorbed into it. The environment in which couples lived reinforced this sense of obligation. Many households were shared spaces, where privacy was limited and daily life unfolded in proximity to others. There were often multiple people under one roof, including family members, servants, or workers. This meant that intimacy had to exist within a setting that was not entirely private. It required awareness and adaptation, turning something deeply personal into something that was carefully managed within a shared space. Religious influence added another layer to this structure. There were specific times when intimacy was discouraged or restricted, based on religious calendars and teachings. This meant that even within marriage, the couple did not have full control over their own relationship. Their private life was shaped by external rules that defined when it was appropriate to act and when it was not. Intimacy was not just a matter of personal decision, it was part of a broader system of order. Despite these constraints, human emotion did not disappear. Some couples found ways to build understanding over time, developing a form of connection that allowed them to navigate their situation more comfortably. But this was not guaranteed. The system itself did not prioritize emotional closeness. It prioritized stability, continuity, and the fulfillment of roles. Any deeper connection had to emerge within those limits. What makes this difficult to fully grasp is how different it is from modern expectations. Today, relationships are often built around mutual choice, communication, and shared desire. In contrast, medieval marriage treated intimacy as something that had to happen regardless of feeling. It was closer to a responsibility than a shared experience. It was something embedded within daily life, shaped by expectation rather than guided by personal preference. The more closely this structure is examined, the clearer it becomes that marriage was not designed to create comfort. It was designed to maintain order. The couple existed within that design, moving through it as best they could. Their personal experiences were real, but they were shaped by forces that extended far beyond them. This is what gives medieval marriage its weight. It was not simply a personal bond. It was a part of a larger system that controlled behavior and defined roles. Intimacy, within this system, was not free. It was directed, expected, and often detached from individual desire. Marriage in the Middle Ages was built on obligation rather than feeling, turning intimacy into something that had to be fulfilled instead of something that was freely shared. As this system tried to contain and direct human behavior, it revealed its own limitations. Because what comes next is not about how well these rules worked, but about how even the church could not fully control what people continued to do in private. The authority of the church in the Middle Ages appears overwhelming when viewed from a distance. Its teachings shaped laws, guided behavior, and defined what was considered right and wrong in nearly every aspect of life. Sermons repeated the same expectations. reinforcing the idea that moral order could be maintained if people followed what they were told. It created the impression of a system that reached into every home, every relationship, and every private moment, leaving little room for deviation. But authority, no matter how strong it appears, has limits when it meets human behavior. The church could define rules, but it could not fully control how those rules were lived. Behind closed doors, individuals continued to make decisions shaped by their own needs, fears, and circumstances. These decisions did not always align with what was preached. This created a quiet but constant gap between instruction and reality. Religious teachings about relationships were detailed and specific. They outlined when intimacy was acceptable, when it was considered sinful, and under what conditions it should occur. These rules were not vague suggestions. They were presented as part of a moral structure that people were expected to follow closely. The idea was that by controlling behavior, order could be preserved and spiritual well-being could be protected. In practice, however, daily life was far more complicated. People lived in environments where strict adherence to these rules was not always possible. Marriage, as already shaped by obligation, did not guarantee emotional connection. Desire did not disappear simply because it was restricted. Instead, it continued to exist in ways that were less visible, often adapted to fit within or around the boundaries that had been set. This is where the difference between what was taught and what was done becomes most apparent. The church spoke openly about sin, but individuals navigated their own realities quietly. They made compromises, justified their actions, and developed ways of living that allowed them to balance expectation with experience. These choices rarely appeared straightforwardly in official records, but traces of them remain. Confession offers one of the clearest glimpses into this hidden world. Individuals were expected to confess their sins, to speak openly about actions and thoughts that went against religious teaching. While this system was meant to enforce control, it also revealed how often those rules were not followed. The range of confessions shows a reality far more active and complex than the formal teachings would suggest. It becomes clear that people were not simply obeying, they were struggling, negotiating, and often failing to meet the standards set for them. The existence of these confessions highlights something important. It shows that behavior did not stop at the boundary of what was allowed. It continued beyond it. The church could respond to these actions through guidance or punishment, but it could not prevent them entirely. This created a cycle where rules were established, broken, confessed, and then repeated again. Community life also played a role in shaping this gap. People lived closely with one another, aware of each other's reputations and actions. This created pressure to appear compliant, even when reality was different. Public behavior often reflected what was expected, while private behavior reflected what was actually lived. The result was a kind of dual existence, where individuals maintained one version of themselves for the community and another for their own private lives. This duality was not always deliberate. In many cases, it was simply the result of living within a system that could not fully account for human complexity. People were not constantly rebelling against authority, but they were not perfectly following it either. They moved within the system, adjusting their behavior as needed, sometimes aligning with expectations and sometimes moving away from them. Even within religious institutions themselves, this gap could be observed. Monasteries and other religious communities were meant to represent a life of discipline and separation from worldly concerns. Yet records and accounts suggest that they were not entirely removed from the same patterns seen in wider society. This does not diminish the role of the church, but it does show that no system can fully remove human behavior from its influence. What makes this particularly striking is how it contrasts with modern assumptions. It is easy to imagine that strong authority leads to strict compliance, but history shows that compliance is often partial. Rules influence behavior, but they do not define it completely. People continue to act in ways that reflect their own experiences, even within systems designed to guide them. The Middle Ages were not a time when individuals lived in perfect alignment with religious teaching. They were a time when individuals lived under that teaching, responding to it in ways that were shaped by their own realities. This created a society where appearance and reality did not always match, where what was spoken publicly differed from what was lived privately. Understanding this helps to reveal the true nature of the period. It was not a world of complete control, but a world of ongoing negotiation between authority and human behaviour. The church defined the structure, but individuals filled that structure with actions that did not always follow the intended design. As this gap becomes clearer, it changes how the entire subject is viewed. It is no longer a story of restriction alone. It becomes a story of how people lived within restriction, how they adapted to it, and how they continued to express parts of themselves even when those parts were not fully accepted. The church could define what was right and wrong, but it could not fully control what people continued to do once they were out of sight. As this gap between rule and reality widens, it begins to expose something far more unsettling beneath the surface. What comes next is not about control at all, but about how a society that tried to suppress desire ended up becoming deeply obsessed with it in ways that were impossible to ignore. The more closely the Middle Ages are examined, the clearer it becomes that restriction did not erase desire, it reshaped how it appeared. From a distance, the period looks defined by control, by rules that aim to limit behaviour and maintain order. It is easy to assume that such a system would reduce the presence of intimacy in daily life. But what emerges instead is something far more complex. The very act of restriction created a constant awareness of what was being restricted. When a subject is placed under continuous scrutiny, it does not disappear. It becomes more noticeable. It begins to appear in places where it is not expected, carried through indirect forms that allow it to exist without openly challenging authority. In medieval society, this process can be seen in the way people spoke, recorded, and even joked about matters that were supposed to remain controlled. The surface remained orderly, but beneath it, there was constant movement. Religious teaching played a central role in this dynamic. Defining what was considered acceptable and what was not, created a framework that required continuous attention. Individuals were expected to monitor their thoughts and actions, to recognize when they had crossed a boundary, and to seek correction through confession. This process kept the subject present in the mind, even when it was not openly discussed. It turned private experience into something that had to be examined, remembered, and repeated in a structured way. Confession in particular reveals how persistent this awareness was. People were not only expected to admit actions, but also to reflect on thoughts, intentions, and temptations. This meant that even moments that did not result in visible behaviour were still considered significant. The act of confessing required individuals to revisit these experiences, to describe them, and to place them within a moral framework. In doing so, it ensured that the subject remained active in their consciousness. Beyond religious settings, this awareness continued in everyday life. Stories circulated within communities, often carrying meanings that were understood without being stated directly. Humour became one of the ways in which sensitive topics could be approached without openly confronting them. Jokes allowed people to acknowledge shared understanding while maintaining the appearance of distance. In these forms, the subject was not absent, it was present in a way that could be managed. Rumours also played a role in maintaining this constant attention. In closely connected communities, information moved quickly, often blending truth and speculation. Stories about relationships, behaviour, and private actions spread from one person to another, creating a shared awareness that extended beyond direct observation. This did not mean that everything was known, but it did mean that the subject was never entirely hidden. It existed within the network of communication that shaped daily life. What makes this particularly striking is how it contrasts with the idea of suppression. Suppression suggests removal, an absence created by strict control. But what appears instead is concentration. The subject did not disappear. It gathered within specific channels, becoming more defined in the process. It was shaped by the rules that attempted to limit it, taking on forms that allowed it to continue within those limits. The physical environment added another layer to this pattern. Living conditions often placed individuals in proximity to one another, reducing the separation between public and private life. This created a situation where behaviour could be observed indirectly, where awareness of others was constant, and where personal actions were never entirely isolated. In such an environment, attention naturally increased. The boundaries between what was known and what was assumed became less clear. Even the language used during the period reflects this tension. Direct expression was often avoided in formal contexts, but indirect references were common. Descriptions, metaphors, and coded language allowed people to communicate ideas without stating them openly. This created a shared understanding that existed beneath the surface of official discourse. It allowed the subject to remain present while still appearing controlled. Over time, this combination of restriction and indirect expression created a culture where the subject was both hidden and constantly present. It was not discussed openly in the same way as other aspects of life, but it was never fully absent from thought or conversation. It existed in a state of partial visibility, shaped by the need to remain within acceptable boundaries. This is what makes the Middle Ages difficult to interpret through a modern lens. The expectation that restriction leads to absence does not hold. Instead, restriction leads to transformation. It changes how something appears, where it is expressed, and how it is understood. It creates layers that must be carefully examined to see what lies beneath. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes that the period was not defined by a lack of desire, but by the way desire was managed. It was contained, redirected, and often disguised. But it continued to exist. It influenced behaviour, shaped communication, and remained a constant presence within the structure of daily life. This creates a sense of tension that runs through the entire period. On one side, there is the appearance of control, reinforced by rules and expectations. On the other hand, there is the persistence of human experience, moving through those rules in ways that are not always visible. The interaction between these two sides defines much of what is seen. What appears at first to be a tightly controlled world is actually one where attention to desire never fades. It only shifts into quieter and more indirect forms. As this attention grows, it begins to reveal something that cannot be fully contained by rules alone. The next layer is not about how often desire was present, but about how it was forced into spaces where it became heavier, more physical, and far less romantic than modern imagination would suggest. A wedding night in the Middle Ages was not shaped by curiosity or tenderness. It unfolded under expectation, where something arranged in public had to be completed in private. Once the ceremony ended, attention moved quickly away from celebration and toward confirmation. The union was not considered fully real until it had been physically carried out, and this understanding placed an immediate weight on both individuals involved. What might be imagined today as a quiet beginning was, in reality, a moment already defined before it began. For many women, this moment arrived without a clear sense of what it would involve. Knowledge about the body was often limited, shaped by fragments of information rather than open explanation. Preparation did not come through understanding, but through warning. The transition into marriage was not gradual. It was sudden, marked by the expectation that something specific had to happen, regardless of personal readiness. This created a sense of unease that settled in even before the night began. The pressure placed on the bride extended beyond her own experience. Her body was tied to ideas of honour that belonged not just to her, but to her entire family. What happened during that night could affect how she was seen by others, influencing her reputation in ways that were difficult to reverse. This meant that the moment carried consequences that reached far beyond the room in which it took place. It turned something deeply personal into something connected to social standing. For the groom, the situation carried its own expectations. He was expected to act with certainty, to complete what was required, and to demonstrate that the marriage had been fulfilled. This was not simply about the relationship itself. It was connected to ideas of authority and capability that shaped how he would be perceived. There was little room for hesitation, and the expectation of success created its own form of pressure. The environment in which this moment occurred made it even more complex. Many homes did not provide true privacy. Space was limited, and others were often nearby, aware of what was expected to take place. Even without direct observation, the presence of others could be felt. This awareness made it difficult for the couple to experience the moment as something entirely their own. It existed within a shared environment, where personal boundaries were not fully separated from daily life. In some cases, there was an expectation that the outcome would be known. The confirmation of the bride's virginity could become a matter of discussion or evidence, depending on local customs. While not every situation involved direct verification, the possibility alone influenced how the night was approached. It reinforced the idea that the moment was not entirely private, but part of a larger system concerned with legitimacy and inheritance. The physical experience itself was often shaped by this lack of preparation. Without a clear understanding or communication, the encounter could be uncomfortable or even painful. This was not necessarily treated as unusual. It was often accepted as part of the process, something that accompanied the transition into marriage. The focus remained on completion rather than comfort, on fulfilling expectation rather than creating a shared experience. What stands out most is the absence of negotiation. Modern perspectives often emphasize communication and mutual readiness. In contrast, medieval marriage created a situation where expectation replaced discussion. The act itself was considered part of the agreement, not something that required separate consideration. This changed how the moment was experienced, turning it into something that had to happen rather than something that could be approached gradually. The involvement of family, even indirectly, added to this pressure. The outcome of the night was tied to future expectations, particularly the production of children. This extended the significance of the moment beyond the individuals themselves. It became a step within a larger process, one that connected personal experience to social structure. The couple was at the center of this process, but they were not in control of its meaning. Despite these conditions, not every experience followed the same pattern. Some couples adjusted over time, finding ways to build understanding within the limits they faced. But this was not something guaranteed by the system. It was something that developed despite it. The structure itself did not encourage patience or exploration. It required completion, often without regard for how that completion felt. The contrast between expectation and experience is what defines this moment. It is often imagined as a beginning filled with closeness and discovery. In reality, it was frequently marked by pressure, uncertainty, and the need to meet external demands. The emotional and physical aspects were shaped by forces that extended beyond the individuals involved, leaving little space for personal comfort. This moment reflects a broader pattern within medieval life. Personal experiences were often shaped by systems that prioritized order over individual feeling. What might be considered private in one context became part of a larger structure in another. The wedding night is one of the clearest examples of this, where the personal and the social became inseparable. A wedding night in the Middle Ages was not a gentle beginning, but a moment defined by pressure, where expectation mattered more than comfort and proof mattered more than feeling. As that pressure did not end with a single night, it continued to shape how individuals were judged and controlled. What follows reveals how a woman's body itself became something monitored, valued, and treated as part of a larger system rather than something that belonged only to her. Virginity in the Middle Ages was not understood as a private condition. It was treated as something that carried visible value, something that could influence how an entire family was judged. A young woman's body became closely tied to ideas of honor, not only her own, but that of those around her. what might seem like a personal matter in another context was, in this setting, part of a broader system that connected reputation, trust, and social standing. This connection did not exist abstractly. It shaped behaviour, expectations, and decisions long before marriage even took place. Families monitored their daughters carefully, not only out of concern for morality, but because of what was at stake. A single accusation, even without proof, could damage a family's reputation in ways that were difficult to repair. In closely connected communities, where information moved quickly and memory was long, such damage could affect future opportunities, alliances, and security. The body of a young woman was therefore not treated as something entirely her own. It was seen as something that had to be protected, managed, and preserved for a specific purpose. That purpose was marriage. More precisely, it was the ability to enter marriage with a status that confirmed legitimacy and stability. Virginity became a kind of guarantee, a sign that the family had maintained control and that the future union would be free from doubt. This transformed intimacy before marriage into something far more serious than a personal decision. It was not simply about two individuals acting on their feelings. It was about the potential consequences that extended beyond them. If a relationship became known, or even suspected, it could affect how the woman was viewed, how her family was treated, and whether a future marriage would be possible. The risk was not only emotional, it was social and economic. What makes this system particularly striking is how it framed responsibility. The burden of maintaining this form of honour fell heavily on women. Their actions were observed more closely, judged more strictly, and remembered more clearly. While men were not entirely free from expectation, the consequences they faced were often less severe or more easily overlooked. This created an imbalance that shaped how behaviour was understood and responded to within the community. Control extended into daily life in ways that were both visible and subtle. Movement could be restricted, interactions monitored, and opportunities for privacy limited. Families created environments that reduced the possibility of unsupervised contact, reinforcing the idea that protection required constant attention. These measures were not always presented as control. They were often framed as care, as necessary steps to ensure safety and preserve future stability. At the same time, the system relied heavily on perception. What others believed could matter as much as what actually happened. Rumours, once spread, could become difficult to challenge, especially in communities where reputation was built over long periods. This meant that even the appearance of impropriety could carry consequences. The need to maintain a certain image became as important as maintaining reality itself. This emphasis on perception reveals another layer of the system. Virginity was not only about physical reality, it was about belief, about what could be demonstrated or accepted as true. In some cases, this led to practices aimed at confirming or displaying purity, turning a personal condition into something that could be examined or discussed. The body became a point of evidence, tied to expectations that extended beyond the individual. The connection between virginity and property also played a role in shaping this system. Marriage often involved the transfer of wealth, land, or other resources. Ensuring that a union was legitimate meant ensuring that any children produced within it could inherit without dispute. This created a direct link between a woman's body and the distribution of property. Virginity became part of the mechanism that protected these arrangements, reinforcing its importance within the social structure. What emerges from this is a system that is not driven solely by moral concern. While religious teaching contributed to the importance placed on purity, it was not the only force at work. Economic interests, social stability, and the need to maintain clear lines of inheritance all contributed to the same outcome. The control of women's bodies served multiple purposes at once, making it deeply embedded within the structure of the time. This makes it difficult to separate personal experience from broader forces. A young woman's life was shaped by expectations that were not entirely her own. Her choices, her movements, and her interactions were influenced by a system that viewed her body as something that carried value beyond her as an individual. This value had to be preserved, not only for her future, but for the standing of her entire family. The emotional impact of this system is not always visible in records, but it can be inferred from the conditions it created. Living under constant observation, knowing that reputation could be affected by both action and perception, created a form of pressure that was difficult to escape. It shaped how individuals understood themselves and how they moved through their daily lives. Despite these constraints, human behavior did not always align perfectly with expectations. Relationships still formed, risks were still taken, and situations arose that challenged the system. When they did, the consequences could be severe, not only for the individuals involved but for those connected to them. This reinforced the need for control, creating a cycle where pressure and behavior continued to influence each other. Looking at this system closely reveals how deeply it was tied to the structure of medieval life. It was not an isolated idea, but part of a network of beliefs and practices that shaped how society functioned. Virginity became a point where personal experience, social expectation, and economic interest all intersected, making it one of the most controlled aspects of a woman's life. Virginity in the Middle Ages was not simply a personal condition, but a form of social value that determined how a woman and her family were judged and treated. As this value became more tightly controlled, it began to shape how desire itself was understood and restricted. Another layer reveals how even the idea of pleasure was reinterpreted, not as something to be shared, but as something that had to serve a specific purpose within this system. Ideas about female pleasure in the Middle Ages were not absent, but they did not function in the way modern understanding might suggest. Some medical beliefs of the time acknowledged that women experienced desire and that physical response played a role in reproduction. These ideas did not emerge from a place of equality or personal freedom. They developed within a framework that aimed to explain the body in ways that supported existing structures of marriage and inheritance. According to certain theories, conception required more than the act itself. It required a response from both individuals involved. This led to the belief that a woman's body had to reach a certain state for pregnancy to occur. At first glance, this appears to recognize female experience in a meaningful way. It suggests that women were not entirely excluded from discussions of desire, but a closer look reveals that this recognition was limited and conditional. The purpose of this belief was not to validate personal experience. It was to ensure that reproduction could be explained and managed. Female pleasure, within this context, was not treated as something valuable on its own. It was treated as a function. It existed only in relation to its role in producing children. This meant that even when the concept was acknowledged, it did not lead to greater freedom or autonomy. Instead, it created another layer of control. If a woman's body was believed to play an active role in conception, then her behavior and response became something to observe, interpret, and guide. The body was no longer simply a passive participant. It became an object of explanation. This explanation did not belong to the individual. It belonged to the system that sought to understand and regulate it. Medical texts and teachings often approach the body in a detached way, describing functions and processes without reference to personal experience. This created a separation between what was felt and how it was understood. A woman's experience was filtered through interpretations that served broader purposes. It was described, categorized, and placed within a framework that prioritized order and predictability. This framework reinforced existing expectations within marriage. Intimacy remained tied to reproduction, and any recognition of pleasure was absorbed into that purpose. It did not create space for individual exploration. It did not change the structure of relationships. It simply adjusted the explanation of how those relationships functioned. The result was a system where recognition did not lead to change. Social expectations further limited how these ideas were experienced in practice. Women were still expected to fulfill roles defined by family and community. Their behaviour was monitored, and their choices were shaped by the same pressures that governed other aspects of life. The acknowledgement of desire did not remove these pressures. It existed alongside them, constrained by the same boundaries. The lack of open discussion also played a role in shaping the experience. While certain ideas existed in medical or academic contexts, they were not always translated into everyday understanding. Knowledge remained uneven, and many individuals relied on fragments of information that were passed down through informal channels. This created a gap between theory and lived experience, where what was written did not always reflect what was understood. In this environment, female pleasure became something that was both present and restricted. It was recognized in theory, but limited in practice. It was acknowledged in specific contexts, but not openly discussed in daily life. This created a situation where the concept existed without becoming fully integrated into how people understood themselves or their relationships. The emphasis on control remained consistent. Even when the body was described in more active terms, it was still subject to external interpretation. Decisions about behavior were guided by expectations that extended beyond the individual. This meant that personal experience did not define understanding. Understanding was shaped by systems that placed the body within a larger structure. This pattern reflects a broader theme within the period. Recognition did not always lead to change. Ideas could exist within a system without altering its fundamental structure. They could be absorbed, reinterpreted, and used to support existing expectations rather than challenge them. This is what happened with the concept of female pleasure. The result was a complex and often contradictory situation. On one level, there was acknowledgement of desire. On the other hand, there was continued restriction. These two elements did not cancel each other out. They coexisted, creating a layered understanding that is difficult to interpret from a modern perspective. It is not a story of complete denial, but it is also not a story of acceptance. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that the concept of pleasure was shaped by purpose. It was defined by what it contributed to the system, not by what it meant to the individual. This limited how it could be understood and experienced. It remained within boundaries that were set by forces outside the person who experienced it. This reveals something important about how the Middle Ages approached the body. It was not simply ignored or misunderstood. It was actively interpreted. But that interpretation was guided by specific goals. Those goals were tied to stability, reproduction, and social order. Everything else was secondary. As these layers are considered together, a clearer picture begins to form. Female pleasure was not erased, but it was not allowed to exist freely. It was shaped, directed, and contained within a system that determined its meaning. This created a reality that was neither fully restrictive nor fully open, but something in between. Female pleasure in the Middle Ages was not denied, but it was redefined in a way that kept it firmly within the boundaries of control and purpose. As this redefinition becomes clearer, it begins to connect with something that extends beyond individual experience. A deeper layer reveals how discussions of intimacy were never truly private, but tied to larger concerns about legitimacy, inheritance, and the fear of uncertainty that shaped the entire society. Discussion of the body in the Middle Ages did not always avoid directness. In certain contexts, especially within medical and legal writings, descriptions of physical response appeared with a level of clarity that can seem unexpected from a modern perspective. These texts did not always hide behind vague language. They attempted to describe processes, to explain how the body functioned, and to place those functions within a framework that could be understood and applied. This clarity, however, did not come from a desire to explore personal experience. It came from a need to explain outcomes that mattered to the structure of society. Reproduction stood at the center of this effort. The continuation of family lines, the transfer of property, and the stability of social order all depended on it. As a result, any discussion of the body was shaped by this central concern. Within this framework, physical response became something that needed to be understood in practical terms. Some theories suggested that both individuals contributed to conception and that certain conditions had to be met for it to occur successfully. This led to a recognition of bodily processes that might otherwise have been ignored. The language used to describe these processes could be direct, even detailed, because it served a specific purpose. At first glance, this directness can appear to signal a level of openness. It can seem as though the subject was approached without hesitation, as though it was accepted as a natural part of life. But this impression fades when the purpose behind the discussion is considered more carefully. The focus was not on the experience itself. It was the result that the experience was expected to produce. Legal context further reinforced this approach. Questions about marriage, legitimacy, and inheritance required clear definitions. In disputes over whether a marriage had been properly completed or whether a union could produce heirs, the details of physical interaction became relevant. These situations required language that could address the issue directly. The body was examined not for its own sake, but as part of a process that had legal consequences. This created a situation where clarity and restriction existed at the same time. The body could be described in precise terms, but those descriptions were always directed toward a specific outcome. There was no separation between understanding and control. Knowledge was used to reinforce the system, not to challenge it. This meant that even the most direct discussions remained within the boundaries of expectation. The effect of this approach was subtle but significant. It allowed the subject to be present in formal context without becoming personal. It could be discussed openly in certain settings, but only within the limits defined by purpose. Outside of those settings, the same subject returned to a state of partial silence, managed through indirect expression and controlled awareness. This duality shaped how people understood their own experiences. On one level, there was knowledge that acknowledged physical response. On the other hand, there was a structure that limited how that response could be interpreted. Individuals were aware of the processes described in texts, but their own experiences were filtered through expectations that emphasized duty and outcome over personal meaning. The presence of these discussions also reflects the broader priorities of the time. Society was organized around continuity and stability. Every aspect of life that contributed to these goals was given attention. The body, as a central part of reproduction, became a subject that could not be ignored. But it was not approached in isolation. It was always connected to the larger system in which it functioned. This connection limited how far the discussion could go. While certain details could be acknowledged, they could not be separated from their purpose. The idea of exploring physical experience for its own sake did not fit within this framework. It did not contribute to the goals that guided the system. As a result, it remained outside the scope of what was considered meaningful. The contrast between modern expectation and medieval reality becomes clear at this point. Today, discussions of the body are often tied to individual experience and personal understanding. In the Middle Ages, they were tied to function. The difference is not in the presence of knowledge, but in how that knowledge was used. It was directed toward maintaining order rather than expanding awareness. This creates a sense of distance that is not immediately obvious. The language may appear familiar, the recognition of physical processes may seem similar, but the intention behind it is different. It reflects a way of thinking that places the individual within a larger structure, where personal experience is secondary to collective stability. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that these discussions were not about openness. They were about precision. They aimed to define and control, to ensure that outcomes could be predicted and managed. The body was treated as part of a system, something that could be understood to serve a purpose. This approach left little room for interpretation beyond what was required. The result is a picture that feels both clear and constrained. There is knowledge, but it is limited in how it can be applied. There is recognition, but it does not lead to freedom. There is directness, but it exists within boundaries that are carefully maintained. This combination defines how the subject appears within the period. Discussion of physical response in the Middle Ages could be surprisingly direct. but it was never meant to explore personal experience, only to ensure that reproduction followed the expected path. As this focus on outcome becomes more apparent, it begins to reveal the risks that surround it. Deeper layers show how any uncertainty about reproduction could threaten not just relationships, but entire systems of inheritance and power. Adultery in the Middle Ages was not understood primarily as a matter of personal betrayal. It was viewed as a disruption to a system that depended on certainty. Relationships were closely tied to inheritance, and inheritance required clarity about lineage. In a society where property, titles, and social position were passed down through family lines, any doubt about parentage could create consequences that extended far beyond the individuals involved. This made intimacy a matter of structure rather than emotion. The question of who shared a bed with whom was not simply about personal connection. It was about the potential outcomes of that connection, particularly the possibility of children. A child born within a marriage was expected to carry the identity and rights of the father. This expectation formed the basis of how property and authority were transferred. When that expectation was challenged, the stability of the system itself came into question. Adultery introduced uncertainty into this structure. If a married woman was suspected of being involved with someone outside her marriage, the legitimacy of any child she bore could be doubted. This doubt was not a minor concern. It could lead to disputes over inheritance, conflicts within families, and challenges to established authority. The presence of uncertainty had the potential to unsettle arrangements that had been carefully constructed and maintained. Because of this, the fear surrounding adultery was not limited to moral judgment. It was tied directly to practical consequences. Families depended on clear lines of descent to secure their position. Land, wealth, and titles were all connected to this clarity. When it was disrupted, the effects could be wide-reaching. What might appear as a private matter became a point of concern for entire households and communities. The way this fear was expressed often focused on women. Their bodies became the point at which certainty could either be maintained or lost. While men could also engage in relationships outside marriage, the consequences attached to their actions were different. A man's involvement outside marriage did not create the same uncertainty about inheritance. This imbalance placed a heavier burden on women, making their behavior subject to closer observation and stricter judgment. Control became the primary response to this risk. Families and communities developed ways to monitor and limit opportunities for behavior that could lead to uncertainty. Movement was observed, interactions were managed, and situations that allowed for unsupervised contact were often avoided. These measures were not always presented as restrictions. They were framed as necessary steps to protect stability and prevent potential conflict. At the same time, reputation played a critical role in maintaining the system. Even without clear evidence, suspicion alone could be damaging. In closely connected communities, where information spread quickly and was not easily forgotten, an accusation could carry long-lasting consequences. This meant that maintaining appearance was as important as maintaining reality. Individuals were expected to avoid not only improper behavior, but also situations that might lead to suspicion. Legal systems reflected this concern as well. Cases involving adultery could involve questions about legitimacy, inheritance, and responsibility. The focus was not only on the act itself, but on its potential outcomes. Determining whether a child belonged to a particular lineage was a matter that could require investigation and judgment. These cases reveal how deeply the issue was connected to the structure of society. The emotional aspect of adultery, while not absent, was often secondary to these concerns. Personal betrayal was recognized, but it did not carry the same weight as the consequences for inheritance and social order. This does not mean that individuals did not feel anger or disappointment. It means that the system in which they lived placed greater emphasis on stability than on personal experience. This difference becomes clearer when compared to modern perspectives. Today, discussions of adultery often center on trust, emotion, and personal relationships. In the Middle Ages, these elements existed, but they were not the primary focus. The primary concern was the effect on lineage and the potential disruption of established structures. This shifted the way the issue was understood and addressed. The constant awareness of this risk shaped behaviour in subtle ways. It influenced how people interacted, how relationships were formed, and how boundaries were maintained. It created an environment where personal actions were connected to broader consequences, reinforcing the importance of control and caution. This awareness was not always visible, but it was present in the decisions people made. Despite these measures, uncertainty could not be eliminated. Human behaviour does not always follow the structures designed to contain it. Relationships still formed outside expected boundaries, and situations arose that challenged the system. When they did, the consequences could be significant, not only for the individuals involved but for those connected to them. This reveals a deeper tension within the society. On one side, there was a strong desire for order and certainty. On the other hand, there was the reality of human behaviour, which could not be fully controlled. The interaction between these two forces shaped how adultery was understood and why it was feared. Looking more closely, it becomes clear that adultery represented more than a personal act. It represented a point where individual behaviour could intersect with the structure of society in a way that created instability. This is what gave it its significance. It was not simply about breaking a rule. It was about introducing doubt into a system that depended on clarity. Adultery in the Middle Ages was feared not just as a betrayal between individuals, but as a threat to the certainty that held families, property, and power together. As this fear of uncertainty deepened, it began to shape how society responded to behaviour that could not be easily controlled. This next layer reveals how that response did not eliminate risk, but instead pushed it into spaces where it became more hidden, more accepted, and quietly integrated into everyday life. Prostitution in the Middle Ages was not always hidden in the way modern imagination often assumes. In many towns and growing cities, it existed in forms that were known, recognised,